The air conditioning in interview room 2 had been broken since April, and nobody had fixed it because fixing things in Corrigan County required a purchase order approved by the Chief Deputy's office, and the Chief Deputy's office had other priorities. Nora Carver sat with her hands folded on the table, her wrists still faintly red from where the zip cuffs had been. They'd switched her to steel bracelets when she arrived, which was protocol, and she noted that the officer who switched them was careful not to look at her face. His nameplate said Guthrie. He was maybe 26. She'd signed for a birthday card for his mother 2 months ago, a collection that went around the department every year, organized by dispatch. Detective Sergeant Aaron Pruitt sat across from her with a manila folder he hadn't opened yet. He was the kind of man who believed in the theatrical value of props. He'd set a paper cup of water in front of her which she hadn't touched, and a recorder on the table between them which he hadn't turned on yet either. Outside the window, one of those narrow rectangles set high up on the wall, she could hear the parking lot. An engine idling, a radio crackling something she couldn't quite make out. The distant pulse of a 10-4, then dispatch answering with a unit number she recognized as Malvern's. "You want to tell me about the meth, Nora?" Pruitt asked. His voice was easy. This was his professional register. Relaxed, almost bored, the tone of a man who had done this many times and found most people exhausting. He had forearms like dock rope and a habit of tapping his wedding ring against any hard surface when he was thinking, which she had observed over 4 years of working in the same building. He was tapping it now. "I don't use," she said. "I never have." "That's not what I asked." "I know what you asked." He waited. That was his other technique. Most people couldn't tolerate silence in a room like this with a recorder on the table and their freedom sitting in the balance. Most people started talking to fill it. Nora looked at the wall to the left of his head and thought about her daughter's soccer practice, which was in 2 hours, and whether her sister Renee could get her there. "Found 2.4 grams in the center console," Pruitt said. "Ziploc sandwich bag. Deputy Malvern found it during a routine stop. You were doing 47 in a school zone." "I wasn't in a school zone." "Sunrise Road and Kellner, that's a school zone after 3. It was 2:40 in the afternoon. School's out at 2:30. She turned her eyes to him then. "Aaron, we both know what's in that folder." Something moved behind his eyes and then went still. "I'd like a lawyer," she said. The interview ended 12 minutes later. What took 12 minutes was not her willingness to talk, she had nothing more to say, but the administrative process of logging her formal invocation of counsel, which required 3 separate forms in Corrigan County, 2 of which Pruitt filled out incorrectly the first time. She sat with her hands in her lap while he worked through the paperwork. She kept her breathing even. She watched the recorder. It had been running since before he walked in, she noticed, which meant the recording would begin partway through her informal statements, which meant she would have to establish a timeline later through other means. She made a mental note to include that detail in the message she was going to send as soon as she got to a phone. Corrigan County sat in the upper left corner of Georgia like something that had been overlooked. 60,000 people, give or take, spread across red clay hills and Kudzuchoke Creek bottoms and towns that had been almost cities in the 1970s and then quietly hadn't been. The county seat was Delwood, which had a courthouse and a Waffle House and a paper mill that still ran 2 shifts, and a sheriff's department that occupied a converted school building on the south side of town. The converted school had been somebody's idea of efficient use of county resources in 1998. The cafeteria was the motor pool now. The gymnasium was where they held training, and twice a year the deputies' union picnic. The old home economics room, on the northeast corner of the 2nd floor with the best cross-ventilation in the building, was the Evidence and Property Unit, which the officers abbreviated to EPU in daily conversation. Though only the people who actually worked there, all 3 of them, used the abbreviation with anything like familiarity. Nora had run it for 4 years. Before that, she'd done 3 years in purchasing for the county road department, which was where she'd learned that the machinery of local government moved on paperwork the way rivers move on gravity, slowly, inevitably, and it would get there eventually, but it would carve up everything in its path if you weren't paying attention. She'd grown up in Corrigan County, left at 18 for Georgia State, got a degree in criminal justice administration that she'd originally intended to use somewhere else, somewhere with a skyline. She'd met Paul Carver in Atlanta when she was 24, married him at 26, moved back to Delwood at 29 because his trucking job based him out of Macon and her mother was sick, and somehow the temporary solution had become the permanent one. The marriage hadn't made it past 34. Paul wasn't a bad man. They'd just become strangers to each other with a shared mortgage and a daughter named Lily, and the divorce had been civil and sad and entirely exhausting. She'd applied for the evidence unit position in a week when she needed to feel useful at something she was actually capable of. The interview had lasted 20 minutes. She was the only applicant with records management experience. The previous custodian, a man named Deaver, had retired abruptly after 30 years, and the transition had left the unit in disarray. Chain of custody logs that didn't reconcile, property tags that had been relabeled, submission records that referenced case numbers no longer in the active system. She spent the first 6 months just cleaning up what Deaver had left behind. Nobody thanked her. Nobody much paid attention to evidence and property unless a case went to trial and the defense started asking questions. Walt Briggs noticed, though. Chief Deputy Walter Earl Briggs was not what people expected when they thought of a corrupt law enforcement officer. He was not fat, he was not loud. He didn't have a red face and he didn't haunt roadside bars after his shift. He was tall and economical in his movements, and he had a face that was just slightly too lean to be handsome. High cheekbones, pale gray eyes, a jaw that had been strong at 40 and now at 54 had the quality of weathered stone. His father had been a deputy for 20 years and his grandfather before that had been the county tax assessor, which wasn't the same thing but carried some of the same community weight. He'd been with the department since he was 22. He had a modest house near the reservoir and a fishing boat he used on Sundays and a second phone he kept in the tackle box on the boat when he wasn't using it. He went to church, not every Sunday but enough. He knew every judge in 2 counties by their first name. He'd coached youth baseball until his knees gave out at 47. He had been stealing from the evidence room for 11 years. Not dramatically, that was important to understand about him. He had not started with grand ambitions or a formal scheme. It had begun as these things usually do, with an opportunity so small it barely registered as a decision. A seizure of oxycodone in 2013, 180 tablets from a traffic stop on I-75. The case had pled out before it went to evidence for trial use. The pills were technically scheduled for destruction, but the destruction order had gotten lost in the paperwork backlog, Deaver's backlog, the same one Nora would later spend 6 months untangling, and the pills were just sitting there in a sealed evidence bag on a shelf in the room on the 2nd floor, tagged with a case number no one was watching anymore. Briggs had known a man, not a dealer exactly, a man who knew a man who operated in the gray margin between pharmaceutical distribution and something else. The first transaction had felt like holding his breath underwater. After that it got easier, the way most things do once you've already decided you're capable of them. By the time Nora arrived, the operation had achieved a kind of quiet sophistication. Small quantities selected carefully from cases that had closed, evidence technically awaiting destruction. The replacement of drug samples with inert lookalike material in ongoing cases, that part had started later and it was Pruitt who managed it, and it was that part that would ultimately prove catastrophic. Briggs justified it the way men like him always justify things that have gone on long enough to feel normal. The county underpaid everyone. He'd given 30 years to this community. The defendants whose drugs he'd taken had mostly been prosecuted on other evidence anyway. He'd never planted evidence on an innocent person. He'd never let someone dangerous walk free. These were the bright lines he'd drawn for himself, and mostly he'd stayed on the right side of them, if you understood that the lines themselves had shifted incrementally over the years until they weren't quite where they'd started. What made Briggs dangerous was not his greed, it was his competence. He was genuinely good at his job. He knew police procedure the way a carpenter knows wood, the grain of it, the give, the places it would hold a nail and the places it wouldn't. He had improved the department's conviction rate by 12% in his first 6 years as chief deputy. He'd modernized dispatch, negotiated a mutual aid agreement with the adjacent county, and personally handled the investigation that brought down a meth distribution network operating out of a chicken processing plant in 2018, which had gotten him a commendation from the state attorney general and a photo in the front hallway of the sheriff's department building. He had first paid attention to Nora not because he was threatened by her but because she was competent, and competence was a quality he noticed in people the way a watchmaker notices precision instruments. He'd walked through the evidence unit about 6 months after she started, done a routine inspection with the sheriff, and watched her explain her reorganization of the property log system. She'd built a cross-reference index connecting the old handwritten submission cards to the digital tracking system, linking physical shelf locations to case numbers to chain of custody dates in a way that Deaver's patchwork had never managed. She explained it without notes, walking them through the logic of it, and the sheriff had nodded thoughtfully, and Briggs had looked at the color-coded tags on the shelving units and had thought clearly and without alarm, she's going to find the gaps eventually. Not immediately, not even soon. She'd need time, and she'd need to understand what she was looking at. But the thought had been there, a stone placed at the back of his mind, and he'd kept it there while things continued to function as they had. He did not do anything rash. He began instead to manage proximity, visiting the unit less often, routing cert submission categories through PRUT, quietly redirecting the intake for specific task force operations to a secondary log that only PRUT and one other officer maintained. He had the secondary log designated under a task force name, Ironwood. He filed no formation order for it in the main records system. No personnel assignments, no case plan document, no originating authorization. The name appeared in lab routing notes and submission records as if its existence were self-evident, which in a department where Briggs had accumulated 23 years of institutional authority, it more or less was. For a while it worked, and then it stopped working because Nora Carver was thorough in the particular way that comes not from ambition but from something closer to ingrained habit. She simply could not leave a record in disorder. The first discrepancy had been a number on a page, and she hadn't even been looking for it. She'd been working the fiscal year reconciliation file in October of her second year, a quarterly accounting of evidence items logged versus items returned, destroyed or forwarded to lab, when she pulled the GBI lab report for State v. Marcus Odell to verify a return notation. The lab report showed the methamphetamine sample at 61.2% purity. The original field test documentation in the submission file showed an estimated 78%. Field tests were not precision instruments, she knew that. A 17-point variance was unusual but not impossible, especially across a 9-month storage period between seizure and lab analysis. She'd flagged it in the internal review log as a notation, standard procedure. Then she'd moved on because she had 47 other reconciliation items to get through before the end of the month. She found the second discrepancy 3 months later nearly by accident while retrieving a related case file. Her cross-reference index sent her through a set of 2018 submissions that showed an abnormal lab-to-field variance pattern, not identical to Odell, smaller margins, but consistent in direction. The lab reading was always lower than the field estimate, always without exception. She sat in the evidence room on a Wednesday afternoon in late January, the building mostly quiet around her at 4:30, the heating system knocking in the walls the way it did when the season was turning toward the edge of cold. The room smelled of dust and plastic and faintly of the industrial cleaner she used on the shelving once a month. Outside, through the narrow windows, she could see the parking lot and a stretch of Caldwell Street and the top of the Baptist church steeple 2 blocks over, the light going orange at the edges as the sun dropped behind the tree line. She spread the 2 files on her work table and looked at them side by side and thought about what else they had in common besides the variance. The Odell case had been a task force operation. The 2018 case had also been task force. She pulled every task force submission from the past 5 years. She did this over the following 3 weeks, working incrementally between her regular workflow so it didn't look like a dedicated search. An hour here, 45 minutes there. The normal rhythms of someone doing thorough quarterly reconciliation. She found 6 cases with similar patterns, all task force, all showing lab readings trending below field estimates by margins outside the standard GBI deviation allowance. She also found, while pulling the task force files, that a subset of them, 11 in all, referenced a task force designation called Ironwood. When she searched the department's main records system for Ironwood formation documentation, it wasn't there. She submitted a records request through the department intranet. Standard form addressed to the Chief Deputy's Administrative Coordinator. Request for Ironwood formation documentation, personnel assignment records, and original case plan. No response for 2 weeks. She submitted the request again, attaching the first submission as reference. The response, when it came, was 4 lines from the admin coordinator. The request had been forwarded to the appropriate supervisor for review and would be addressed in due course. She thought about that phrase for a few days, in due course. She'd worked in county administration long enough to know that it was not a phrase used in good faith. It was a phrase used when someone needed time and didn't want to say so. She drove to Cartersville on a Saturday afternoon, told Renee she was running an errand, and sat across from a retired GBI agent named Clifford Tassin in a Panera off I-75. Tassin was 61, had spent 20 years in narcotics investigations, the last 6 as a unit supervisor, and had the quality of an instrument that had been finely calibrated by a specific kind of work. He was compact, with reading glasses he didn't put on until he was looking at something smaller than a standard page, and he sat across from Nora in the restaurant's corner booth and listened to her lay out everything she had without interrupting once. She was precise, she didn't speculate. She described what she'd documented, the specific cases, the nature of the variance patterns, the Ironwood gap, the non-response to her records requests, and when she finished, she set her summary printout on the table between them. 3 pages, her own formatting, the kind of document that would look comfortable in a formal audit report. Tassin looked at it, he picked it up. He turned to the second page, which showed her purity variance data in a 2-column table. "You said 6 cases initially," he said. "You're showing 11 here. The initial 6 were the ones I was confident about. The additional 5 have the pattern but involve lab conditions that could independently explain part of the variance. I separated them. But you included them. For completeness." He set the pages down and looked at them for a moment. How many of the 11 had convictions that held? 8. What happened to the other 3? 2 pled to lesser charges before trial. The third, Odell, is serving 12 years on the primary count. Tassin took his coffee cup and looked at it rather than drinking from it. Outside the window, the interstate made its constant sound, the hiss and rumble of traffic that never stopped. "Who ran Ironwood?" he asked. "That's the thing, I can't find a formation order for it. It's referenced in submissions, in lab routing notes, but there's no originating documentation in the system. No case plan, no personnel assignments, 4 years of submissions under a designation that doesn't officially exist." He set his coffee down. "When did you start documenting what you have?" "About 3 weeks after I found the first variance." "You kept copies?" "Off-site." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite surprise, more the expression of someone who has calibrated their expectations downward over time and occasionally encounters evidence that this is wrong. He picked up his coffee again, and she noticed his hands, the careful, slightly stiff movement of someone who had spent years handling firearms and evidence bags, and the accumulated physical vocabulary of that work. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You're still working there," he said. It was not a question. "Every day. And nobody inside the department knows what you have." "Nobody." He set the cup down again and looked at his hands for a moment. "The thing about evidence tampering at this scale," he said, "is that it doesn't stay contained. You start pulling one thread and you find threads behind it. Cases that look clean start looking less clean. Convictions that held start showing the cracks." He paused. "You understand what that means for people who are in prison right now?" "Yes," she said, "I understand that." "I have a contact at the Atlanta field office," he said. "FBI, not GBI. The reason I say FBI is that if what you're describing is what I think it is, you want federal jurisdiction from the start, or this disappears into the same drainage system you're trying to map." He wrote a name and phone number on a paper napkin. "Call her," he said, "not from the buildings, not from your home landline." Special Agent Dana Thibodeaux ran a public corruption unit out of the Atlanta field office and had the particular quality of stillness that comes to people who have spent a long time doing work that requires them not to react visibly to things. She was 47, originally from New Iberia, Louisiana, and had a face that people trusted before they knew why. She met Nora twice in person, once at a rest stop off I-85, once at Thibodeaux's personal apartment in Buckhead, and the rest of the time they communicated through an encrypted messaging application Nora downloaded on a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a Walmart in Cartersville. The FBI had been aware of Corrigan County for a while, Thibodeaux told her, not specifically of Briggs, more of a data point, a CI's passing reference to pill distribution in the upper Georgia corridor that had a geographic signature consistent with institutional access. Not enough to act on, not enough even to open a formal investigation with confidence. What Nora had was different, what Nora had was paper. "What I need from you," Thibodeaux said at the kitchen table in Buckhead, both their phones face down, the television turned to local news at a low volume, "is patience. If we move too soon, we collapse the case against the wrong people. We need Briggs and we need his supply chain, and we need enough of the evidence tampering documentation that the U.S. attorney is comfortable walking into a federal courtroom with it." "How long?" 4 months, maybe 6. 6 months is a long time to keep working there. "I know. He watches me," Nora said. "Tell me what that looks like." She described it. The way Briggs would stop in the hallway outside the unit and then not come in. The way Prude had started routing Ironwood-related submissions through Officer Delray rather than directly to her. The reassignment of 2 evidence techs who'd worked under her, Watts and Grier, to patrol duties. Ostensibly a staffing shortage, but both transfers had been initiated within 3 weeks of her second Ironwood records request. The way the maintenance requests she submitted for the evidence room, a leaking ceiling tile, a broken drawer track in the secondary storage unit, had been sitting unresolved for 4 months when previously they'd been turned around in 2 weeks. None of it was dramatic. None of it was provable as targeted harassment. It was the accumulation of small frictions that, taken individually, were just the normal frustrations of working in an underfunded county department. Taken together and mapped against a timeline, they told a different story. Thibodeaux listened to all of it. She wrote some of it down in a yellow legal pad she kept in a locked case. "Do you have family in the area?" she asked. "My daughter, my sister." "Your daughter is how old?" 9. Thibodeaux was quiet for a moment, looking at the legal pad. "Nora, I want you to think seriously about whether you want to continue. What you're describing suggests they may already be monitoring you informally. If they move against you before we're ready." "I know," Nora said. "I've thought about it." "What did you decide?" Nora thought about Marcus Odell, whose 12-year sentence had rested partly on evidence whose chain of custody she now believed had been compromised. She thought about the other names in those case files, people she'd never met and would never meet, whose lives had been shaped by paperwork she'd had her hands on. She thought about Deaver, 30 years, then gone, the building none the wiser, and about what his silence had cost and for whom. "I decided to keep going," she said, "and to be more careful." There was a Sunday in November, about 2 months into her work with Thibodeaux, when Lily came and sat at the kitchen table while Nora was making coffee and said, "Are you in trouble?" Nora turned around. Lily was 9 and small for her age and had Paul's eyes, the particular gray-green that she'd forgotten she'd once found beautiful, and she was looking at Nora with the expression children have when they've been holding a question for a while before deciding to ask it. "What makes you ask that?" "You keep checking your phone." "I check my phone a lot." "Not like this." Nora sat down across from her daughter. The kitchen was warm, the November light coming through the curtains at a low angle and lying in bars across the table between them. She thought about what to say. She'd spent 14 months thinking carefully about what she said and to whom and when, and now she was sitting across from her daughter who had noticed something, and she had no framework for this conversation because she'd never intended there to be one. "I'm working on something," she said. "It's a little complicated." "At work?" "Yes." "Is it about the drugs they say you had?" Nora went still for a moment. "Where did you hear about that?" "Grace's mom told Grace's mom told Grace." Lily's syntax had the recursive quality of third-grade information chains. "Grace told me, she said you got arrested." "I haven't been arrested." That was still true then, the arrest was still 8 months away. "I was questioned, there's a difference." "Is there trouble at your job?" "There are some things at my job that aren't right," Nora said. "I'm trying to make sure the right people know about it, that's all." Lily considered this. She had Paul's deliberateness too, the way he'd take information and sit with it before responding, which Nora had once found maddening in arguments and now watched in her daughter and thought, good, that will serve her. Are you going to be okay? Lily asked. Yes, Nora said, I'm going to be careful and I'm going to be okay. She believed this when she said it, which was important. She'd always been able to tell the difference between the things she said to her daughter to manage her and the things she actually believed, and she tried never to let those overlap. Lily got up and got herself a glass of juice from the refrigerator and said, okay, and drifted back toward the living room with the easy trust of someone who had decided that was enough information for now. Nora sat at the table for a moment after she left, looking at the bars of light on the tabletop, and thought about the coffee can in the crawl space and the thumb drive inside it, and about what it meant to be careful. She was careful. She copied everything to a thumb drive kept in a coffee can in the crawl space under her kitchen floor, wrapped in a plastic bag and taped to a floor joist. She documented her system access times and what she viewed and when, creating a log that mapped every evidence room action to a legitimate work purpose, so that if her computer access records were later pulled, her activity would be accountable. She varied her office hours slightly, not enough to seem evasive, just enough to prevent a predictable pattern that could be worked around. She was pleasant to Briggs in the hallway. She attended the birthday card circulation for Guthrie's mother and signed it in her normal handwriting. She gave Thibodeaux's 22 cases over the following 14 months. 11 of them contained documentable chain of custody anomalies. She reconstructed 4 years of Ironwood Task Force submissions from secondary records, lab routing copies, court filing exhibits entered in related cases, GBI correspondence logs accessed through a public records request she submitted to the lab directly rather than through the department. It was the kind of work that required not intelligence so much as patience, the willingness to follow a thread through 40 dead ends before finding the one that actually led somewhere. She had not told anyone inside the department, not the sheriff, whose relationship with Briggs she couldn't map with confidence, not anyone in patrol, not Watts or Grier, whom she'd been close to and who'd been reassigned in what she believed was a deliberate isolation maneuver. She worked alone in the room that smelled of dust and plastic and industrial cleaner, the seasons changing in the walls, and she kept the door closed and she waited. She'd been at it for 14 months when Briggs ran out of patience. What changed things was not anything she'd done. It was a case scheduled for appeal, State v. Renford, a 2020 distribution conviction. The defense attorney filed a motion challenging the chain of custody of the primary drug evidence, and in preparing the production response, a young prosecutor named Harkins noticed that the log entries for 2 of the Renford drug submissions had been amended after their original entry dates. The amendment timestamps were embedded in the file metadata. Harkins, 29 and still thorough by reflex, had included the observation in a memo to his supervising attorney, who forwarded it to the sheriff's office as a potential Brady issue requiring their response. The sheriff's office forwarded it to Briggs. Nora didn't know any of this at the time. She found it out later, working backward through the timeline the way she worked through everything. What she knew in the present tense was that on a Tuesday afternoon in August, at 2:40 p.m., Deputy Malvern had pulled her over on Sunrise Road. He'd said her registration was expired. She'd known her registration was current, renewed in June, sticker on the plate, but she'd also understood immediately, in the way you understand a change in air pressure before a storm, that the registration was not the point. The search was the point. Malvern had requested consent. She hadn't given it. He'd said he smelled something and called it probable cause, which was within his authority to assert and technically not reviewable at the roadside, and she'd sat on the curb with the heat coming off the asphalt in visible waves and the paper mill smell on the west wind while he went through her car. 2.5 minutes, then, "Ma'am, I need you to stand up, please." He'd showed her the bag without touching it in his gloved hand, a clear Ziploc sandwich bag, maybe 2 grams of something crystalline inside, center console beneath a gas station receipt. She looked at it and felt a kind of cold clarity settle over her, the opposite of panic, the understanding that the next several hours were going to require her to manage herself precisely. "Deputy Malvern," she'd said, "I would like you to note for your report that I am informing you I did not place that in my vehicle." He'd looked at her for a moment. He was maybe 32, medium height, sunburned from patrol work. His body language was not aggressive. He looked more uncomfortable than anything else, which made her think he genuinely didn't know what he was part of. "I understand," he said. "I still need to place you under arrest." "I know." The ride to the department took 40 minutes. She'd composed herself in the first 5 and spent the remaining 35 composing the message she was going to send. The booking process at the Corrigan County Sheriff's Department took 1 hour and 22 minutes, which she tracked by the clock on the processing room wall. She was photographed and fingerprinted by a tech she didn't know, which was unusual. She knew most of the department staff by name. The tech must have been brought in specifically or pulled from a shift she didn't overlap with. She filed that detail away. Her personal effects were itemized in front of her and placed in a property bag: keys, wallet, phone, a hair tie, $43 in cash, a chapstick. The officer filling out the property inventory form made a small error on the cash amount, wrote 34 instead of 43, and Nora said quietly, "That should be 43. The officer corrected it without comment. She watched him initial the correction. She was held in a single-occupancy holding cell while the paperwork was processed, which was standard for a misdemeanor possession charge, and she sat on the bench and looked at the wall and ran through the timeline in her head. The 2 weeks her car had been in the department parking lot. The north side camera is offline since March. The specific placement of the bag, center console under the receipt, which suggested someone who had access to her car, and approximately 4 minutes of unobserved time. She thought about Enciso, the evidence tech who'd left 2 years ago, and about Delray, who worked the north parking lot access sometimes. She noted the possibilities without assigning certainty. Certainty wasn't her job at this point. Documentation was. When Guthrie came to transfer her to interview room 2, she looked at his nameplate the way she always did, a habit from her first weeks in the job, when she'd been learning everyone's names and faces. And she saw the faint pink at the top of his ears that suggested he was embarrassed, and she thought, he doesn't know either. Most of them don't know. That's the thing about operations like this. They work because they stay small at the center and invisible at the edges. She got to a phone 4 hours after the interview with Prout. Her sister Renee arrived with a bondsman before 6 o'clock and posted the $4,800 surety, a figure whose specificity she noted, calibrated exactly to the upper edge of what Renee could manage. The release processing took 1 hour and 15 minutes, which was long for a minor possession charge, and she attributed it to the paperwork being managed slowly on purpose, giving someone inside time to do something she couldn't yet identify. Outside in the parking lot, Renee held her without saying anything. Renee was 40 and ran a hair salon on Palmetto Street and had the quality of people who work on their feet and talk all day. She knew when not to talk. Nora texted from her personal phone in the car, nothing case-related, just logistics. Then she went home, got Lily situated at Renee's for the night, and retrieved the prepaid phone from the back of her sock drawer, where she'd moved it 2 weeks ago when the first of the small pressures had started feeling less small. She sent 3 words and a number to Thibodeaux. It moved, Tuesday. She sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet of the house and looked at the ceiling. Her wrists still ached faintly. She pressed her thumb against the inside of her left wrist where the cuff had been and felt the slight warmth there, and thought about how the body keeps a record whether you intend it to or not. Thibodeaux called from a blocked number 40 minutes later. "Are you okay?" "Yes." "Did you say anything?" "I invoked immediately." "Good, the recorder was on when you came in." "Yes, I noted it." "Okay." A pause. "This changes our timeline. We're not ready, Nora. I want to be honest with you. We have enough to indict Briggs on evidence tampering and potentially on federal drug charges, but the supply chain piece, we wanted another 90 days. I don't have 90 days. They charged me. I'm on administrative suspension pending the criminal proceeding." "I know." Another pause. "I'm going to make some calls tonight. I need you to go nowhere near that building. Do not talk to anyone from the department. Do not call anyone." "I understand." "Get some sleep. I mean that literally. You're going to need to be sharp." She slept about 3 hours. At 4 in the morning she got up and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and reviewed in her head in sequence everything she'd documented, everything she'd transmitted, every timestamp and case number and amendment record and chain of custody gap. Not out of anxiety but out of habit, the same methodical review she applied to any complex records problem. She looked for holes. She found a few minor ones, edges where her documentation was circumstantial rather than direct, and thought about how those would appear to a defense attorney. Then she thought about how they'd look stacked against 22 cases and 11 years of documented patterns. Outside her window, the sky went from black to the particular Georgia gray-blue that preceded sunrise, and somewhere in the neighborhood a dog barked twice and stopped, and the day came anyway, indifferent to all of it. Walt Briggs learned about the federal warrant at 7:43 on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Nora's arrest. He learned about it not because anyone at the federal level contacted him, but because Leanne, his secretary, 16 years in the chief deputy's office, not involved in anything, came to his door and said there were vehicles in the parking lot with federal plates, and she wasn't sure but she thought he should know. He'd had a thought in the car on the way in that morning, brief, flickering, that the Renford appeal documentation hadn't been resolved the way Harkins had indicated. He'd pushed it down. He'd been pushing things down for 11 days, which was how he'd been operating for 11 years and which had always worked. He walked to the window and looked at the parking lot. 4 federal vehicles, black and silver, pulled into the visitor section. He recognized the configuration. He'd been part of operations where that many vehicles arrived in the parking lot of someone who didn't know they were coming, and he understood the geometry of it: 2 vehicles per objective, which meant 2 simultaneous arrests minimum, which meant this was not a preliminary inquiry. This was an execution. He looked at the Attorney General commendation photo on the wall. Him and Commissioner Rawls both smiling for the camera. Then he went back to his desk and called Prout. Prout's phone rang twice and went to voicemail. He called once more, then he set the phone on the desk very precisely, parallel to the edge. He straightened a stack of folders that didn't need straightening. The room was quiet except for the central air, which functioned perfectly in his office. Special Agent Thibodeaux knocked on his door at 7:56. She came in with 2 other agents and a deputy U.S. Marshal. She had the warrant in a folder and she read it at a pace that was neither rushed nor ceremonial, the pace of a document that had been carefully constructed and didn't require performance to land. When she finished, she said, "Chief Deputy Briggs, you are under arrest," without particular emphasis, the way someone states a fact that has already been established and simply needs to be named. He did not resist. He stood up, which required more effort than usual because his legs had gone somewhat unreliable in the way they sometimes do when information finally finishes traveling from the brain to the rest of the body. He held out his wrists. One of the agents applied the cuffs with professional efficiency, the steel closing with a sound he'd heard from the other side thousands of times. He was thinking about the tackle box on the fishing boat at the reservoir. The second phone inside it. Whether that had been recovered already or whether it was still there, and when he ran that calculation he understood that either way it was no longer a variable that changed his situation. They walked him through his own building. He kept his eyes forward and felt the hallway's attention on him. He had 23 years of reading rooms and he could feel the specific quality of people trying not to look. Leanne made a sound behind him, a small involuntary sound that he didn't turn to acknowledge. Somewhere behind him, from the first floor, he heard voices raised, Prout's simultaneous arrest, or Delray's, proceeding in a separate corridor with separate agents and separate warrants. At the front doors he stepped out into the August morning, the parking lot full of federal vehicles, the paper mill smell on the west wind, the hazy flat blue sky above Delwood that he had looked at most mornings of his adult life. The agent on his left said, "Watch your head," at the car door, and he ducked carefully and the door closed. Aaron Prout had been in the men's room on the first floor when the agents came for him. He came out with his hands already raised, which no one had asked him to do but which was what his body did, some autonomic response below rational decision-making. He stood in the fluorescent corridor with 3 federal agents watching him and felt the thing he'd been suppressing for years arrive all at once in his chest, like a room filling with water from the floor up. His wife's name was Carla. He thought about Carla the way you think about something you've broken before you've finished breaking it. He was processed at the federal building in Atlanta. He asked for a lawyer immediately and was given one, a federal public defender named Abrams who showed up at 2 in the afternoon with a tablet and a styrofoam coffee cup and the particular weary efficiency of a person with too many cases and a clear understanding of exactly what each one cost. Prout told Abrams everything inside 3 hours. Not because Abrams had advised him to. Abrams was measured and careful about what he advised. But because the everything had been in him for a long time and the container had broken, and the only thing that felt possible now was to let it out in some orderly way before it got worse. Thibodeaux interviewed Briggs on a Friday, 8 days after the arrest, in a federal interview room that was cooler than the one in Corrigan County and had better chairs. His attorney, Castellan, sat beside him, a recorder on the table visible to everyone. Briggs had spent 8 days in federal custody thinking. He organized his thoughts the way he organized everything, systematically, ranking by importance, discarding what was no longer useful. He'd arrived at a clear-eyed assessment of his situation. The paper trail Thibodeaux had referenced in the warrant affidavit was more complete than he'd believed possible. More complete than he'd believed anyone in that building could have constructed. He looked at Thibodeaux across the table. She was a contained person. She wrote on her notepad without looking down, which was a technique. It kept her eyes on you. He recognized it because he'd used it himself. "You understand we have 22 documented cases," she said. "I understand that's what you've told me. I can walk you through each one." "I'd prefer not," Castellan touched his arm briefly. "What I want to understand is the scope of what you're looking at. Federal charges under 18 U.S.C. 1519 for evidence tampering, 21 U.S.C. 841 for distribution, and RICO predicate acts spanning 11 years. That's the scope." Briggs was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, very still. Thibodeaux observed this with a neutrality that cost her nothing. "I want to ask you something," Briggs said. "Go ahead." "The reconstruction of the Ironwood log, that was from secondary records." "Yes." "Lab routing copies and court filing exhibits." "Among other sources." He nodded slowly. "That took a long time to build." Thibodeaux said nothing. "I'd like to know when it started," he said, "not who, when. Why does that matter to you?" He thought about the fishing boat at the reservoir, the hallway, 23 years of walking into rooms and having them orient toward him. He thought about what it meant that all of it had been undone not by a federal investigation that came looking for him specifically, not by a rival or an informant with a personal motive, but by someone sitting in a room he controlled, going through records that had always been there in order, waiting to be read correctly. "It doesn't," he said finally. "I guess it doesn't matter." Castellan closed his legal pad. "My client is prepared to discuss a cooperation agreement." The indictment unsealed on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 6 weeks after the arrests. It named Briggs, Prout, Officer Kevin Delray, former evidence technician Raul Ensaiz, who had left the department 2 years prior, and a man named Terry Abb, who operated a medical supply business out of Whitfield County and who had been the distribution endpoint for the diverted narcotics. 7 federal counts against Briggs, 3 of which related specifically to the Renford case. Marcus Odell's public defender filed a motion to vacate the following month. The news cycle in Corrigan County lasted about 4 days at full intensity. The Delwood Gazette ran the word corruption across its front page in 80-point type. The Atlanta Constitution ran a longer piece focused on systemic dimensions, how long the operation had run, what oversight mechanisms had failed, which convictions were now under review. A Channel 2 crew drove out from Atlanta for an afternoon, shot the department building, interviewed the county commissioner on the front steps. He used the word transparency 4 times in 6 minutes. Nobody in Delwood was surprised by any of this. The interim sheriff was a woman from the county attorney's office who had the unenviable task of managing a department that had lost its second in command, 3 officers, 1 civilian employee, and a significant portion of its institutional credibility all at once. She initiated a departmental review. She brought in an outside auditor. She issued a public statement that was careful and measured and said very little. Nora's criminal charges were dropped 9 days after the indictment. The DA's office issued a 1-paragraph statement indicating new information had come to light regarding the circumstances of the original traffic stop. The statement used no names. Deputy Malvern was placed on administrative review pending the departmental audit. He had apparently genuinely not known what he was looking at when he found the bag in Nora's center console. He had simply been used. Her administrative suspension was lifted in a letter from the interim sheriff that offered reinstatement with full back pay. It was 1 paragraph, written entirely in the passive voice, as if things had happened to her without agency and were now being corrected without agency, the institutional equivalent of no one in particular having done anything. She read it at her kitchen table and set it down and poured a glass of water and stood at the window. In the backyard, Lily had left a soccer ball in the middle of the grass. She did not go back to the department. She'd made that decision not in the kitchen on Thursday but earlier, somewhere in the 4 a.m. hours of those days between her arrest and the federal operation. She'd turned it over and examined it the way she examined every other problem, looking for holes, checking whether what she believed was actually true or just what she wanted to believe. And she'd found that it was simply true. She did not want to go back to that building, to that room, to the long, meticulous work of managing property for an institution she'd spent 14 months mapping from the inside. This wasn't a statement of principle. It wasn't a declaration. It was a fact about what she wanted, and she'd learned over the past year to pay close attention to those. She drove to Cartersville one morning in September and threw the prepaid phone in a Walmart trash can on her way out. It was probably not the right way to dispose of it, but it was what she did. She spent October in 2 sessions at the Atlanta field office, each 3 hours long, in a conference room that smelled of dry erase markers and bad coffee. The assistant U.S. attorney on the case was a woman named Soto who was precise and prepared and asked questions the way an accountant reviews a spreadsheet, systematically flagging inconsistencies without drama. In the second session, Soto looked up from her notes and asked, "At what point did you believe you were personally at risk?" "About 6 months in," Nora said. "What indicated that to you?" "The reassignment of the 2 techs, the non-response on the records requests, the way Briggs stopped walking into the unit." She paused. "There was a day in February I was leaving the building and he was coming in and we passed in the doorway and he held the door for me, which he'd done many times before. But this time the way he looked at me was different, not hostile, the opposite of hostile." "Can you explain what you mean by that?" "Like I'd already become past tense," Nora said. Soto wrote something down without commenting, which was the right response. The Briggs plea came through in March of the following year. He pleaded guilty to 4 of the 7 federal counts in exchange for testimony against Terry Abb and cooperation in identifying additional narcotics recipients. His attorney had negotiated a sentencing recommendation of 8 years, though the actual sentence rested with the presiding judge, a woman named Alcott with a reputation for departing upward in cases involving public officials. Pruitt went to trial, recanted his cooperation partway through the pretrial phase against Abrams's advice, and then re-entered negotiations in a panic when the government signaled it would seek the full range on all counts. He pleaded to 2 counts with a 7-year recommendation. He and Briggs would serve in separate facilities. At the Briggs sentencing hearing in the federal courthouse in Atlanta, the courtroom was about half full. A few reporters, some families of defendants whose cases were now under review, people from Corrigan County who had made the drive for reasons that didn't have simple names. The county commissioner was not there. Briggs stood when Judge Alcott addressed him and spoke for about 2 minutes, which was what Castellan had prepared him for. He expressed accountability. He used the word ashamed, which was probably the most accurate thing he said in the entire proceeding, though its accuracy was its own complicated matter, because shame and regret are not the same thing. And what Briggs felt was closer to the grief of someone who had built a life, genuinely built parts of it, genuinely served in parts of it, and watched the whole structure fall because he'd built it on a foundation he'd been compromising quietly for years, one small accommodation at a time. Alcott departed upward. She sentenced him to 10 years and made a brief statement about the particular damage done by corruption inside institutions trusted with public safety. She did not moralize extensively. She stated a fact and imposed a sentence, and the room was quiet for a moment after she finished. When they walked him out, Nora watched his back, the Navy Federal holding suit, the careful institutional shuffle of someone being escorted toward a door he hadn't chosen, until he went through it and it closed. She sat in the gallery for a few minutes after the room began to clear. There is a particular quality to the aftermath of proceedings like this, an emptiness that is not quite relief and not quite disappointment and not quite anything with a ready name. She had expected something large and had found instead something smaller and more permanent. The knowledge that she had done the work correctly, that the record was accurate. That the gap between what had happened and what was documented had been closed as much as it was going to be. This was not nothing, she knew that clearly. She also knew that Marcus Odell was still in prison pending his April appeal hearing. She knew there were other names in those case files, people whose convictions were now under a shadow that might or might not dispel, depending on how courts decided to weigh compromised chains of custody against the totality of the evidence. She knew that Deaver, wherever he was in his retirement, had spent 30 years in that evidence room, and that whatever he'd seen or participated in or chosen not to see had died with his departure and would not be dug up in any proceeding she was aware of. She knew that the outside audit had found anomalies predating the 11 years attributable to Briggs, suggesting a continuity of institutional failure that predated any individual culpability and would probably not result in additional charges, and would certainly not result in a systemic remedy that amounted to more than new forms and updated policy language, and a training requirement that would be completed online and forgot. None of this made her a tragic figure. She was not interested in being a tragic figure. She got her coat from the seat beside her and walked out of the courthouse into the April afternoon, which was cool and overcast, the kind of afternoon that couldn't decide whether it was still winter or had already become spring. On the courthouse steps, she passed a woman she didn't recognize, maybe mid-50s, who was sitting on a bench and looked up when Nora came through the door. The woman had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been inside a proceeding like that for a long time, not today's proceeding, but years of them, the accumulated weight of a system working through what it had broken. She had a yellow legal pad on her lap, and she looked at Nora for a moment with the expression of someone who is trying to decide whether they're looking at the right person. Nora didn't stop. She didn't know the woman. But she held her eye for a moment as she passed, and the woman gave her a small nod, not congratulatory, nothing as simple as that, just an acknowledgement that they were both here, that this was real, that it had happened, and Nora nodded back. She found out later from Soto that the woman was the mother of Marcus Odell. His appeal hearing was in 2 weeks. She took a job in March with a private forensic auditing firm in Atlanta that contracted with legal defense teams and occasionally with civil rights organizations reviewing cases with suspected evidence irregularities. The work was similar to what she'd been doing: chain of custody, property logs, submission records, the paper archaeology of what happened before a case became a case. But the clients were different and the outcomes were more directly visible. In her first 4 months, she contributed to 2 successful suppression motions and 1 conviction appeal still working its way through the 11th Circuit. She enrolled Lily in a school with a better soccer program. Renee drove up from Delwood 3 weekends out of 4. The first month in the new apartment, Nora had a run of insomnia that lasted about 2 weeks, nothing dramatic, just the 4 a.m. arrivals that wouldn't stop, her body still operating on the rhythms it had maintained through 14 months of careful, sustained vigilance. She'd sit in the kitchen and read, or not read, and drink water and wait for her nervous system to understand that waiting was no longer required. She thought sometimes in those early mornings in the new kitchen about the evidence room in Delwood, the dust smell and the knocking heat pipes and the narrow windows and the particular quality of late afternoon light that came through them in winter, lying across the shelf tags in thin orange bars. She'd spent 4 years in that room. She knew its inventory the way some people know a piece of music, not by thinking about it but by feel, the sequence of what came where, the logic of how it was organized, who had touched what and when, and what their signatures looked like in the log. She'd miss the work, she thought, not the institution, just the work, the satisfaction of a record that was accurate, a chain of custody that held, a timeline that matched. It stopped eventually, most things did. On a Sunday in May, she drove back to Delwood with Lily, who didn't know why they were going and didn't ask, because 9-year-olds are generally more adaptable than the adults in their lives give them credit for. Nora's stated reason was helping Renee with something at the salon, which was true enough. The other part was harder to name. She went down Caldwell Street in the mid-afternoon, the light carrying that particular quality it had in Georgia in May, thick and golden and already warm enough to suggest what summer would insist upon. The paper mill smell was on the west wind. She'd grown up with that smell and left it and come back to it and was now in the process of leaving it again, and she wasn't sure whether you could say you missed a smell you'd spent most of your life barely noticing. The department building looked like a building. The parking lot had fresh stripping. The north side camera housings had been replaced. She could see the new hardware from the street, white against the old brick, recently installed. The purchase order had gone through. She drove past without stopping. Lily was watching something on her tablet. The radio played something contemporary that neither of them were listening to. She turned onto Route 9 and drove out toward the reservoir. She parked in the gravel lot at the fishing access and they walked down to the water, which was flat and greenish in the afternoon light, the far bank furred with pine and sweet gum, a white heron standing motionless at the edge of the shallows 50 yards off. Lily threw a piece of gravel, it landed short, the heron didn't move. Nora stood with her hands in her jacket pockets. She could smell the water, which smelled different from the creek behind her childhood house, older somehow, deeper, the smell of something that had been here long before anyone started keeping records of it. The gravel shifted slightly under her feet when she moved her weight. There was an aluminum boat pulled partway onto the bank not 20 feet from where she stood. Old hull, faded blue, nobody in it. On the middle seat an orange plastic tackle box latched shut. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about what was in it or what might still be in it, or whether it had been emptied months ago by investigators who'd had the same thought she was having, or by Briggs himself in the window before the warrant, or by nobody at all. She'd given Thibodeaux everything she had. What came after that wasn't hers to carry. She understood that clearly and she didn't always feel it, but she felt it now, standing at the edge of the reservoir in the afternoon light with the sound of the water against the gravel and the smell of pine on the air. The heron was still where it had been. It hadn't moved since they arrived. It stood at the edge of the shallows with the immense patience of something that didn't need to be anywhere else, waiting for the water to show it something, in the particular stillness that certain creatures achieve when they have stopped resisting the requirements of the moment and simply become part of it. Nora watched it for a while. "Mom," Lily said. She was pulling at Nora's sleeve. "Okay," Nora said, "let's go." They walked back up the gravel path to the car. Lily ran ahead. Nora got in and started the engine and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before putting it in drive, looking at nothing in particular through the windshield, the pine trees at the edge of the lot, the sky above them, a deep untroubled blue that would hold for another hour before the light shifted and let the evening in. She pulled out onto Route 9 and drove them home.